Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode of New Books in History, a podcast channel with the New Books Network. I'm one of the channel's hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very excited today to be bringing to you both of the authors of the book, The Making of the Bible, From First Fragments to Sacred Scripture, published by Harvard University Press in 2022. The book brings together two renowned scholars of the Bible to discuss how these documents, in fact, as they argue, Bible should not be thought of as one thing, but there are in fact many different kinds of Bibles, how we ended up with these documents, how this all came together. And they argue that it was a result of diverse developments that unfolded over many, many centuries. And the book goes through these progressions, debates, all sorts of things to explain the books that we may know today in Judaism, in Christianity, and understand where they came from. So I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Konrad Schmid and Dr. Jens Schröter to the podcast.
Hello, Miranda.
Hello.
So I was hoping to ask you both to first start us off with, how did you come together to write this book?
Go ahead, Jens.
One thing is that we know each other already for a long time, and we have a close friendship, and we also have a productive partnership, working together in our fields. So in biblical scholarship, Konrad from the Old Testament perspective, and I'm from the New Testament perspective. And the idea of the book was to bring together our two fields of Old Testament studies and New Testament studies. And we were surprised how good that worked and how productive it was. And another important finding during our work was that there is no such a book that would bring these different findings together that are related to the history of the Bible and the early reception of the Bible. So it's quite important to look at the evidence of the different books of the Bible and how they became, in the end, one book in Christianity and another book in Judaism. And what we did is to depict these developments, and what is quite important for our perspective is that we looked at the history of the Jewish and the Christian Bible as they developed in over a long period, and in the time of early Christianity, Judaism, and the emerging Christianity also were in contact and in opposition, in contact with each other and in opposition to each other, and that is usually not included in history of the Christian Bible.
And I think one can add that probably also our original German publisher had a fair share in the genesis and the production of this book. We first actually thought of writing a book about the canon history of the Bible. So how specifically somehow this list of books in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament came about. And we were in contact with C.H. Beck, which is one of the major publishers in the German scientific landscape. And our lector, he suggested, why don't you somehow treat the whole of the formation of the biblical literature, not just somehow the aspect how this literature became canonical, which is a process that somehow spans the time from the 3rd century before our era to the 2nd century of the Common Era. Why don't you describe the genesis of the biblical books as a whole, how this library came about. And it was not too difficult to win us over for this comprehensive idea. This also meant that we targeted the book towards a little bit a broader audience than just our fellow scholars or persons in scholarship, but that we really somehow wanted to reach out to a broader public. And I think this has worked out quite well. The German original of the book sold very well, and up to now it has been translated into French, and now it's also available in English, which is a great joy for us.
Well, I would certainly say, as an academic, but one definitely not in the field of biblical studies, that I'm very glad that your editor convinced you to have a wider lens. And certainly as someone interested in history generally, this was absolutely fascinating. And I wanted to pick up on something for our next question that Jens mentioned a minute ago, which is this idea of the dialogue and in some ways competition between Judaism and early Christianity. So I was wondering if one or both of you could explain for us why you argue in the book that Judaism's specific form now, Rabbinic Judaism, was developed in dialogue and competition with early Christianity.
Mm-hmm. One important aspect of that topic is that usually today scholars would argue that Christianity grew out of Judaism, and that in the first and second and even in the third century, Christianity was very closely embedded into ancient Judaism. And that is correct, of course. So there were many important historical developments in Judaism of Hellenistic Roman times. So roughly from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. And these developments influenced Christianity very much. So that is one side of the coin, so that Christianity is rooted in Judaism, and that it is not possible to imagine how Christianity could originate or could be shaped without these Jewish scriptures and these Jewish writings. But on the other hand, it is also true that at the end of the 1st and then in the 2nd and 3rd and even in the 4th century, Judaism got its specific form, what we call today Rabbinic Judaism. So a form of Judaism that concentrated on the Hebrew writings and not on the Greek ones, and that developed in a specific way, concentrating on the Torah, so on the law in a specific way, and other aspects of ancient Judaism. And these specific developments were in close contact and in competition with Christianity. So we cannot describe this formation of early Judaism without looking at Christianity as well. So it's a mutual influence and mutual competition also that ended up with two ways of expressing faith in the one God. And of course, Christianity developed its specific way of faith in the one God by adding also the confession to Jesus Christ. And Judaism developed its own way of faith in the one God. So we have a development of two ways, rooting in the same writings, rooting in the same traditions, but then developing roughly in the 1st to the 4th century of a common era in dialogue, competition, and conflict with each other.
Yeah, maybe it's helpful to ask who is the mother and who is the daughter among Judaism and Christianity. And as Jens said I think both options of a sequence are probably justified. In a basic historical sense, of course, Judaism is the mother of Christianity, but somehow in interaction with Judaism and or between Judaism and Christianity, Judaism actually as the predecessor religion also found a specific shape that can be described to a certain extent as somehow originating as a daughter religion from Christianity as the mother religion. So I think it really works both ways, and this is something that we try to describe in our book.
And I think it's really fascinating, this idea of the mother and the daughter and how they come out from each other. So as a follow-up from that question, given that we might be very used to the idea that Christianity comes from Judaism, could you give us an example perhaps of the other side of it? What a particular aspect of Judaism that comes out of it that we might see from this dialogue or competition?
I think this is a very hotly debated and also intensely researched field, and scholars like Israel Yuval and Peter Schäfer have contributed significantly to that. I think for me, one of the good examples somehow to illustrate how Judaism shaped specific religious concepts that it took up from Christianity is, for example, the Pesach Haggadah. So this focus on food, on eating, that nowadays also shapes how in Judaism Pesach is being celebrated. I think that this specific focus has something to do with the centrality of the Lord's Supper, of the Eucharist in the Christian tradition, that somehow Judaism thought, yes, we need to develop something similar. And there, I think this was really a force that came out of Christianity that put so much emphasis on this specific ritual.
Another example would be the form of the Jewish Bible. So that is also a reaction to the understanding of the prophetic writings in early Christianity. So in Christianity, the prophets were very important as witnesses for Jesus Christ. And they took up, so early Christian writings and traditions took up apocalyptic ideas, so ideas of Jewish apocalypticism, so that were developed in Jewish writings from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. And Rabbinic Judaism was very hesitant to adopt these apocalyptic ideas, and they put the Torah in the center, and they understood the prophets as interpreters of the Torah. And that is quite a different understanding of prophetic writings than we have it in Christian development, in the Christian Bible, and also in Christian apocalyptic writings. So, and here you can see in the formation of the Christian tradition vis-a-vis the Jewish tradition, and also the formation of the Jewish Bible in contrast to the Christian Bible, that the prophetic and apocalyptic tradition was interpreted in very different ways.
Brilliant examples. Thank you for sharing them. Staying on the theme of sort of two things going together and going back to your very beginning, the introduction of each of your specialisms, another argument that you make early on in the book was that the phrasing, calling it the Old Testament and the New Testament, juxtaposes not just the two books of the Christian Bible, but also, as you argue, two covenants. Can you explain what you mean by that?
So the original meaning of the word testament, so in Greek it's diatheke, and in Hebrew it's berit, and the original meaning of that term is covenant. So it hasn't to do anything with a book originally. And in this way, it was used in the Jewish writings and also in early Christian writings. If, for example, Paul uses the term diatheke, when he speaks about the first covenant, or the covenant of God with his people Israel, and when he speaks of a new covenant, also this term is already there in Jewish writings, but now it gains a new meaning, namely the covenant that God made with the believers in Jesus Christ. So, and that implies that the term testament in the early times didn't have anything to do with a book, but it was an expression for the covenant of God with Israel and the covenant of God with believers in Jesus Christ. And the distinction of an Old and a New Testament, or an Old and a New Covenant, is of course only meaningful from a Christian perspective. It doesn't make any sense from a Jewish perspective. They have their Bible and they have the faith in the one God, but they don't have an Old Testament opposed to a New Testament.
I think it's absolutely crucial to remind of the fact that the first Christians, they didn't have a New Testament. The only holy scriptures that they read, that they had, this was the Hebrew Bible, but they interpreted these scriptures in a specific perspective. And the New Testament only developed over the first 2 centuries. There were first the letters of Paul, then the Gospels followed. But it's really important to see that the first generations of Christians, and of course also Jesus and Paul, they had nothing else to read than what we know as the Hebrew Bible. So the New Testament is actually just a literary explanation of this specific hermeneutic perspective that the first Christians had towards these writings that are nowadays still the Jewish Bible. But I think it's really important to see that the Bible of the early Christians was not the Old and the New Testament, but it was what later then was called the Old Testament. The terminology first pops up with Melitov from Sardis at the end of the 2nd century CE.
He uses the term Old Testament for the first time for a book, namely for the Jewish writings. And that implies that there is also a New Testament. But if Christians speak in the 2nd century of a New Testament, they do not mean a book, because there was no book that was called New Testament. So in the 1st century, for example, Paul and other authors in the 1st century, they would always speak of the scripture, or the Holy Scripture, or the Holy Scriptures. So the Greek term is graphe, or hagia graphe, and that is sometimes used in the New Testament and is quoted, of course. Scripture says, and for Paul and the other authors, it's absolutely clear that Scripture means the authoritative Jewish writings. So there's no need to explain what Scripture is. So it's the Torah and the prophets and the Psalms and so on. And that this term, testament, is used for books, that is only a later development. As Konrad said, it started at the end of the 2nd century with using the term Old Testament for a book or for writings. And then the distinction of an Old Testament and a New Testament developed out of this usage.
And the term Bible is even later. Bible comes from the Greek term bibloi, and this is attested from the 4th century onward. And literally, Bible actually means books in the plural, which is a very adequate designation for the Bible, because the book is rather a library than just one book. In Judaism, there is actually not a really fixed terminology, what the Christians call Old Testament and what is the Hebrew or the Jewish Bible. Ancient designations for that text corpus are simply Mikra or Mikraot, which means scripture or scriptures. The common term that is also often used in modern Judaism, Tanakh, which is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. These are the 3 parts of the Hebrew Bible, law, prophets, and writings. This acronym only is attested from the Middle Ages on, so this is not really an ancient usage or an ancient designation for the corpus of the Hebrew Bible.
And one could perhaps also add that the term canon, it's a Christian term. It's not appropriate for the Jewish Bible or for the interpretation of the Jewish Bible until today. So it's not very useful in the Jewish tradition. And in the Christian tradition, the term canon was applied to books only in the 4th century, so not before. So in the 4th century, Christian theologians started to speak of a canon of books, meaning a fixed number of books. And before the 4th century, the term canon was used for regulations of the church, so for ethical or dogmatic regulations, but not for books. So that was a new usage of that term when it was applied to a certain number of books that were regarded as authoritative writings.
And so this gives us a fabulous idea of both why your book is very important to illuminate all of this, and the wonderful amounts of detail and honestly questions that you answer in the book. So thank you for explaining those things. I think they give us a really good foundation for my next few questions, which definitely do not cover all of the things in the actual book, but are sort of a whistle-stop tour of some of the particular points that jumped out that I thought might be interesting for our audience. So with the caveat that the next series of questions definitely do not cover everything that is in the book, I'd like to sort of move chronologically and first ask about something that was surprising to me, which was the significant gap that you show between the content of the books in the Bible about David and Solomon versus the archaeological evidence about what was happening when those events are being described. And so what does that gap tell us about the purpose of these books about David and Solomon?
Yeah, this is a really interesting feature when one reads the books of Samuel and Kings, but also the books of Chronicles. The kingdom of David and Solomon, they are really described in the most luxurious terms, and this is a golden age of the first 2 kings of Israel. This kingdom is described really in abundant terms. And if we look at what archaeology found out about the era, the time of David and Solomon, this is really a mismatch to what we seem to learn from the Bible. Archaeology, which has made dramatic progresses in the past few decades, shows that at the time of David and Solomon, this is the 10th century BCE, that at this time there was no monumental architecture in Judah. Jerusalem seems to have been still a relatively small city, and David and Solomon probably were rather chiefs than really kings. Their kingdom was more of a chiefdom. So it seems that the Bible is really exaggerating with regard how they present this reign of David and Solomon. Now, what does this mean? I think that we can see here that the Bible often uses mythical structures in order to explain what it wants to explain. The Bible is, of course, interested in presenting an ideal shape of how Israel and Judah should be organized politically or sociologically. And I think in order to do that, the biblical authors projected their fantasies, their ideas, their concept of how an ideal monarchy should look like as the political system for Israel and Judah. They projected this back into the time of David and Solomon. David and Solomon are clearly historical figures. We know this without any doubt, particularly from an inscription that was found unearthed in 1993, the so-called Tel Dan inscription, which mentions the house of David, and this inscription can be dated to the 9th century BCE. So David is, or the house, the dynasty of David is here in view, is certainly attested at the time. So they were historical figures, but it's not historical how the Bible depicts their reign. This is something that is really much more of something that the Bible longs for, that the Bible thinks should have been the case. And it's often in religious literature that things that authors hope for, that they project this back to the past in order to see, or in order to argue and to claim, as it was before, it will be accordingly also in the future. This seems to be the major logic behind this construction of a golden age that is centered around the figures of David and Solomon.
Thank you for explaining that mismatch. I think that explanation makes a lot of sense, but it's definitely something that probably I'm not the only one surprised by. So continuing our very quick tour through the massive amount of information you cover, how does Deuteronomy build on Near Eastern legal tradition, and what can we add to our understanding of Deuteronomy by understanding this context?
Yes, the book of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Torah, has really a very interesting shape. We know today, particularly also to epigraphical finding, that Deuteronomy is modeled upon a Neo-Assyrian vassal treaty. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was probably the first empire in world history that really deserves this name. The Neo-Assyrians between the 9th and the 7th century BCE, they tried and also achieved to get world dominion, and world of course means the ancient world in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Mesopotamia. They managed to establish an empire in the 8th, 7th century BCE. And this empire was secured not only by military power, but the Assyrians also imposed treaties upon the subdued nations and kings. And these treaties were of the content that the kings, the vassal kings, the subdued kings, they were obliged to be completely loyal to the Assyrian great king. And the book of Deuteronomy apparently knows of these treaties. And now the authors of the book of Deuteronomy took up this concept of vassal treaties, but they completely reformulated it. They subversively received it, and they said, yes, we, the people of Israel, we also are loyal, completely loyal, but not to the Assyrian great king, but we are loyal to our God. And these are probably the very beginnings of the development towards monotheism, a monotheistic structure of the ancient Israelite religion, a monotheistic religion that is enforced by certain laws. And in the also in this era, this idea of divine laws is probably developed for the first time in human intellectual history. Deuteronomy, probably with this very critical concept towards the Assyrians, belongs or must belong towards the end of the Assyrian Empire. Scholarship usually thinks that it belongs to the end of the 7th century BC, because the Assyrians probably were already quite weak. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible in Jerusalem and in ancient Judah to formulate such a concept that is so critical of the Assyrian dominion.
Amazing. I'm just learning a lot by listening. Despite having already obviously read the book. So thinking about the fact that, as you said at the beginning, that the Bible, whether you think about the Torah, whether you think about the Tanakh, whether you think about the Christian Bible, is not actually one book. It's a collection of texts that, as you show throughout the book, are not inevitably all of those things included the way that they are. They're not inevitably in that order. And there's quite a few different types of writing in these texts, including exegesis within the Bible itself. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the significance of this interbiblical exegesis. Why do we have it? And why is it important for the endurance of this otherwise seemingly strange collection of writings?
It is, sorry, Konrad, do you want to?
No, go ahead, please. I can add.
Okay. So in a biblical exegesis is a very interesting phenomenon. So we can see that from a very early point onwards, writings that were regarded as important, as influential for the Jewish people were interpreted, for example, by re-narrating the story. An early example is the Book of Chronicles. So we have it in the Bible itself. The two books of Chronicles re-narrate the history of Israel from a different perspective than the books of Samuel and Kings. And then we have other examples of that as well in Jewish tradition. For example, the so-called books of Jubilees that re-narrates the first book of the Bible, so the book of Genesis, and the beginning of the second book, so the beginning of the book of Exodus. So here we have re-narration. Today it is often called rewritten Bible. And it shows that certain stories and certain books were regarded as important for the self-understanding of the people of Israel. And therefore, they did not only preserve books, but they also interpreted them. And another way of this interpretation, so of interpreting these books, is the translation. So we have an early translation of the Torah and then also of the other Hebrew books. That is the so-called Septuagint. It's a Jewish translation that started in the 3rd century BCE with the Torah. So the Torah was the first part that was interpreted, and then the other biblical books followed. And this Greek translation of the Hebrew texts is also a way of interpreting them. So the translations of these different books are different. So they were done by different translators, and some of them followed their own understanding of these books very clearly. So one can see in comparing the Hebrew and the Greek texts how they interpreted them to make them useful for a new situation. That was the situation in the Greek-speaking world. So when Jews lived in the Greek-speaking world, and also in a new cultural and social and political context, in this case, especially in Alexandria, in Egypt, where this Greek translation of the Bible was done. And an important example in the Septuagint is that there were additions, or there are some additions to the books of Daniel and of Esther. So there are Greek parts of these books that only exist in the Septuagint, but not in the Hebrew original. And to mention just a third way of interpretation is writing commentaries. So, and also this tradition begins in Judaism. So in Qumran, we have some writings that interpret biblical books. For example, the book of Genesis or the book of the prophet Habakkuk. We have the so-called Pesha tradition. So Pesha means interpretation. And we have Jewish writings that are interpretations of other books. And then we have that in the Greek tradition as well, with the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who lived in the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE. So that is a very rich amount of interpretation of books, of Jewish books that were regarded as important, and by translating them, by re-narrating them, by commenting on them, they were made important, or that shows that they were regarded as important for the Jewish people.
Yeah, Miranda, you were specifically also asking about the significance of inner biblical exegesis for the endurance of the text. I think this is a very elementary point that I simply would like to highlight. We only have the Bible as copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. The oldest extant Hebrew Bible is a medieval manuscript from the year 1008 CE. And I think if the biblical text wouldn't have been considered as worthy of interpretation, of being copied, of always being updated, then we wouldn't have the Bible today. I think it's also important to keep in mind the material aspects of how the biblical texts were transmitted in antiquity, probably in biblical times, mostly also the first millennium BCE. Biblical texts existed in a very, very small quantity. We can even reckon that up to the Hellenistic time, up to the 3rd century BCE, maybe biblical texts just existed in single copies, the book of Genesis or parts of Genesis, collections of psalms, of prophetic sayings. And I think that describes the traditions of these biblical texts when they copied the text. They had to copy them because an ancient scroll under usual circumstances is only able to survive physically for about 200 years, 300 years, then it rots away. If they copied these texts, they did not only take care of the text itself, of the wording, but they also took care of the meaning of the text. They somehow applied the text to themselves, and this led to what we nowadays identify as inner biblical exegesis, which simply is a process of updating, commenting, and which also makes the biblical text so rich and so interesting.
So, one of the most interesting, to me at least, pieces that you talk about is the book of Job, because you argue that the book of Job adds something pretty unique to the text and, in fact, clarifies the Bible's presentation as a discursive theological work. I'm glad that you went into a good amount of detail on this particular argument in the book, because I thought it was really interesting. So I was wondering if you could share an overview of it with our audience now.
Yeah, the book of Job, this is really a masterpiece within the Bible. I would say this is really world literature that found its way into the Bible. And at the same time, it's also one of the most critical texts in the Bible with regard to its theology. I think the book of Job is probably the most intellectual book of the Hebrew Bible. I think at first sight, one could think that the book of Job is about the question why just people, good people like Job himself, why they have to suffer in this world. It's a big tractate about this problem of the suffering of just a person. And I think this is not wrong, but I also think there is a deeper dimension to the book of Job. I think the book of Job also deals in a very deep way with the very basic question, how can we even talk about God? How can we conceptualize the idea of God? And I think in the end, the book of Job actually denies the possibilities for humans to discover the plans of God and to understand how and why he acts the way he acts. I think the book of Job argues God is God and the humans are humans, and it's very, very difficult, even impossible for humans to figure out what actually the divine logic is when we look at what happens in the world. God is free to do what he does, and his motives can be, this is what the book of Job presents us, his motives can be even as absurd as this, the book of Job explains. If you somehow want to get a simple answer why Job has to suffer, he is simply the object of a heavenly test, of a test that God and Satan enable in order to see whether Job is only a pious person because his life is so good, because he is so wealthy, or whether he is a pious person and sticks to God out of deeper motives. So I think the book of Job is probably one piece of literature in the Hebrew Bible that is critical about too simplistic theologies like do good things, then you will be treated well also by others, or God will help anyone in every situation. The book of Job says, no, there is a deep gap between what we humans might expect from God and what God is really doing. But in the end, I think there is also the option for readers of the book of Job really somehow to commit themselves to God, because whatever somehow goes wrong in the life with Job, he loses everything. He is at the very end of the book, he is restored. Some readers think this is a little bit of pity, so this makes the book shallow. It's a bit cheap, this restoration, but maybe it's just one option for a particular kind of readers that were very interested in a happy end, but it doesn't take away the overall significance and the worth, the theological weight of this book of Job that I am very fascinated by.
Thank you for explaining that to us. I think it is a really interesting piece. And again, moving on, I'm definitely not covering everything. You'd have to read the whole book for that. I'm trying to ask the interesting questions that I can in this time. How do the findings, if we think back again to the interplay between the texts and the archaeology and the historiography, how do the findings from Qumran help us understand how certain texts and certain groups became authorized, legitimized in Judaism during the Hellenistic Roman period that we've already sort of touched on a bit as being a time of a lot of change? So how does this context from this particular era help us understand what we have now better?
So the writings from Qumran are very important for our understanding of the biblical canon. Of course, the Jewish Bible, not the Christian Bible, but the Jewish Bible. And perhaps one should begin by explaining that in the 40s and 50s of the 20th century, many manuscripts were discovered at Qumran and also at some other places close to the Dead Sea. And among them were fragments or even almost complete scrolls from almost all biblical books. Almost all biblical books are attested at Qumran and also at some other places. Most of these manuscripts are in Hebrew and Aramaic. Some of them are also in Greek, but only a few are in Greek. Most of them are in Hebrew and Aramaic. And what is interesting is that there are also other books that were apparently read and interpreted by the community that lived in Qumran, or by the communities. So that was either one or perhaps also some Jewish groups that lived one after the other at this place, Qumran, where the manuscripts were discovered in the caves nearby. And we have these writings, we have these biblical texts, biblical manuscripts on the one hand, and we have texts that refer to the life and the self-understanding of this group or these groups. And with regard to the biblical manuscripts, it is interesting that among them are not only those which are now in the Jewish Bible and in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. So it's only Jewish writing. So there's not any Christian text in Qumran, only Jewish texts. But not only those only those texts that are now in the Jewish Bible and in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, but also some other books, for example, the Book of Jubilees or the Book of Enoch or books of Enoch. that were also regarded as important. And this is interesting because it shows that the canon, so to speak, if we want to use that term, the canon was not closed at that time. So we have no fixed number of books that were regarded as authoritative, but we have a kernel of the authoritative writings, the Torah and the prophets and the Psalms, but there were many other books that were regarded by some Jewish groups as important and by others not. What is also interesting is that we have different textual versions. A good example is the book of Jeremiah that exists in a longer and a shorter version. The longer version is the Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible. The shorter version is in the Septuagint, so in the Greek translation. And in Qumran, we have both of these versions side by side. Both of them are attested. So there was apparently not one authoritative version of the book of Jeremiah. A similar example is the Pentateuch. So the books of the Torah, the 5 books of the Torah, we have some fragments of these books. They are called in scholarship today reworked Pentateuch. And these fragments also have some differences to the text that we have in our Bibles now. And another example would be the book of Psalms. So there are different manuscripts of the Psalms that show that the book of Psalms had different orders of the Psalm, could have different orders of the Psalms. So what is interesting with these Qumran findings is that our view of the Jewish Bible is quite revised or has changed by these findings. We know that at this time, and that was also the time when Christianity originated. So at this time in Judaism comes very close to the beginnings of Christianity. There was no fixed number, no fixed order, and no fixed text of the Jewish Bible. And this is a situation that Christianity found when Christianity originated. They had to deal with this situation of different Jewish writings that were regarded as authoritative or a bit less authoritative or even not authoritative. And a last point, what is very interesting is that the most interpreted, the most quoted writings in Qumran are the books of Deuteronomy and Psalms and the prophet Isaiah. And these are exactly the writings that are quoted most often also in the New Testament. So that is a quite interesting coincidence. And it shows that these books were regarded as very important by the Qumran community and also by the early Christians.
Thank you for explaining all of that. I think that was, again, something that some of us may have heard of, but understanding the full implications of it was really useful. And so staying on this idea of kind of what gets put in and what doesn't, you raise a question that I admit I'd never thought of, which is, why are there 4 Gospels? Why 4? Why not more than 4? Why those 4? I realize I've just thrown a bunch of questions at you, but if you could briefly explain to us, first, why we have 4 Gospels and why those 4 Gospels, that would be great.
Yeah, that is quite an interesting question. And we have, at the end of the 2nd century, the first Christian theologian who gives a reason why the church has to have 4 Gospels. And this is Irenaeus. He was a bishop, an early bishop, and he deals with that very question. Why are there 4 Gospels? And he says there are 4 directions of the wind and 4 pillars of the earth. And he gives some examples for the number 4. But this is, of course, a later interpretation of a fact that was already established. So that means that at the end of the century, there was already a collection of 4 Gospels. And these Christian authors of the second half of the 2nd century knew that there were more Gospels, and they quote also from other Gospels. So Irenaeus knows that there were more Gospels, and also Clement of Alexandria and other early Christian theologians knew that there were not only these 4 Gospels, but also, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Mary, or the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of the Hebrews, and there were many other Gospels, what we call today apocryphal Gospels. And so it is not so easy to explain why the church should have exactly 4 Gospels. So it's a very interesting quotation from the early 3rd century theologian Origen. He says, the church has 4 Gospels, the heresy has many. That's an interesting quotation, because it would be much more convincing if the church would have only 1 Gospel or 2, but not 4. And the reason for these 4 Gospels apparently is that they originated quite early, so still in the 1st century, perhaps between 70 and 100, so in the last 3 decades of the 1st century, that they were used by many communities, Christian communities, that they were accepted by many communities, and that they were in agreement with what was regarded as the basic content of Christian faith. And in the course of the 2nd and the 3rd century, it was necessary to debate about the basic content and the basic confession of Christianity. And in this context, the early creeds, so the Apostolic Creed and some other creeds originated. And these creeds were in agreement with the accepted writings, and the other way around. The accepted writings should be in agreement with these early creeds. And this is a process in that a distinction between accepted and disputed and rejected writings emerged. So this was the first categorization in the 2nd and 3rd century. So there were accepted writings, accepted by early theologians and by Christian communities. Some of them were disputed, and some of these disputed writings ended up in the New Testament, and some did not. For example, the Apocalypse of John, so the Revelation of John, was disputed, and eventually it became part of the New Testament. But another apocalypse, the Apocalypse of Peter, was also widespread and read in early Christianity, but eventually it did not become part of the New Testament. So we have here a gray zone, so to speak, of writings that were disputed, and we have also a 3rd category of rejected writings. And with regard to the Gospels, it was obviously the case that these 4 were regarded as the basic and authoritative and reliable witness of Jesus's life and death and resurrection. And the other Gospels were produced later, and they were used by Christian groups that were in competition with early Christian communities and with other communities and with early Christian theologians. And so in the end, it was not a clear-cut distinction, but it was a development that ended up with a 4 Gospel collection as the reliable witness of the church on the one hand, and other Gospels that were regarded as heretical or apocryphal Gospels on the other.
In my view, in theological terms, one thing I really find fascinating is that the Bible, with these four Gospels, somehow includes a fence against its own fundamentalistic interpretation. There are several elements in the Bible itself somehow that preclude a strict, literal, and fundamentalistic reading of the Bible. So the four Gospels, I think, is one element that shows that apparently early Christians somehow were fascinated by a perspectivic way of perceiving the figure of Jesus Christ. Another element in the Bible, especially in the Christian Bible, is that never in the history of the Bible there was a clear, defined relationship between Old and New Testament. The Old Testament was never subordinated to the New Testament, and the New Testament was never subordinated to the Old Testament, but this was always kept in a delicate balance, which I find a very, very wise decision of the transmission process. And maybe a third element that one could mention here is what Jens explained beforehand with the writings of Qumran. If we look at the transmission of the biblical text in the 2nd and the 1st century BCE, as the textual witnesses from Qumran show it, we can see that the specific letters of the biblical text were not yet fixed. The books of the Hebrew Bible were finished, but they existed side by side in a slight variety of their orthography, of their wording, and it was only after the catastrophe of 70 CE that only one strand of the textual transmission, the Pharisaic rabbinic strand, somehow survived. But beforehand, there was no clear definition what actually the very, very definite and specific wording of the Bible is. So I think this is something that is also relevant for an adequate perception of the Bible in the 21st century.
Yeah, perhaps one could just add to this that these developments, what Konrad has just mentioned, and also the four Gospels. So it was, of course, known to the early theologians that there were differences between the Gospels, and they discussed especially the differences between the Gospel of John on the one hand and the other three Gospels on the other. So there are many differences, and that was, of course, known. So they were aware of that there were differences between the biblical books. And also the balanced relationship between the Old and the New Testament in the Christian Bible. All that shows that the Bibles are not a testimony of unity, but of diversity. And that was a conscious way of developing this tradition. So it was not a dogmatic decision to have only a unified book, but it was development or multiplicity of developments leading to this collection or these collections, one could say. And these collections are by themselves testimony of multiplicity or diversity.
I think that brings us really nicely to kind of, in some ways, sum up a lot of the key elements of the book. So I'll move on to my penultimate question, which I ask everyone, because often when we write these books, particularly when they go into such detail, there are often aspects that as readers are surprising, but as the people writing them, you're much, much closer to the information, and what sort of pops out at you might be different. And I think it's always really interesting to hear a bit about the research process. So if I could ask each of you, what was something particularly surprising that you discovered in the process of writing this book? It could be something big, small, something that did make it into the final version, something that didn't. what would your answer be?
Yeah, maybe I can start with a very formal aspect of our collaboration. I think this is the experience of every academic, that if you do collaborative work, if you have to work on a text as a group of 2, 3, or 4 persons, if you would write your text alone in 1 hour, if you are 2 persons, you will need 2 hours. If you're 3 persons, you will need 3 hours, because you have to accommodate all these different perspectives of the people that are included in that group and that are committed to that project. And for me, a very surprising element was how how speedy and how swiftly our collaboration went on, and how easily we actually were able to produce this book. Of course, one factor that was quite important for the progress of our book was that we could divide many chapters quite easily among ourselves. So the Hebrew Bible chapters first went to me, and the New Testament chapters first went to Jens. But of course, everyone read everything, but it was very easy somehow to get along and to produce a book that is not just the addition of its part, but a little bit more than that. This was something that surprised me, I have to admit.
What a great surprise.
Yeah, for me, it was surprising how smoothly it went to bring our different perspectives, our different expertise together, and how nicely we could organize the book and describe historical development from the earliest stages through the developments in Judaism of the Persian and Hellenistic Roman period up to the first centuries of the Common Era. So that was, for me, a very nice and surprising experience, that from the very beginning, it was a very good cooperation, and in personal terms, but also with regard to the theme of the book, that it went very well to work on these different topics and bring them together and make a coherent book out of that. So that was a very, very good way of writing the book.
Amazing. Well, thank you both for sharing that. I think it's good to hear that you managed to put all of these things together in a way that not only works for the readers, but was not a horrible process for either of you to go through either. And to move then to my last question, which does always seem a bit mean to ask, given that, of course, you wrote this book in German. It's now been translated into 2 languages. It's only just come out in English. And yet, what I'm going to ask you is my final question. What are you working on now or next?
Yes, it probably won't come as a surprise, given our last answers, that there will be a next project. I think it could have very well been the case that after somehow teaming up for writing such a book, such a pair of authors would decide this was a good experience, but now let's leave it as it is. But actually, it was really the success of this book that overwhelmed us, and that also encouraged us to think of a follow-up project. We are now in the very early stages and phases of conceptualizing a possible follow-up project. We are thinking currently of writing a book about a global history of the Bible's cultural impact on different civilizations and also different fields of civilization. We do not want simply somehow to cover different samples of biblical texts that somehow were received in art, literature, and so on. But we want to discover and to analyze the deeper impacts that the Bible had, for example, on scientific thinking, on how legal systems developed, on how literature and language evolved in different cultures. So this is something that we now envisioned to do. But of course, this is something which goes beyond our competencies as biblical scholars. So we need to team up a little bit with experts from adjacent fields, and this first requires also some periods of planning before we really can embark on this.
Well, I think that's very exciting that you're doing another massive project. I think there will definitely be a lot of readers who are interested in the scope of what you're proposing. So hopefully when you've written that, it will also be translated into English, and you'll maybe come back on the podcast and we can interview you about that next project, whenever that may be. But in the meantime, listeners can read your current book, which in English is titled The Making of the Bible from First Fragments to Sacred Scripture, which is published by Harvard University Press this year, 2022. Thank you very much, Dr. Konrad Schmid and Dr. Jens Schröter, for coming onto the podcast today.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.
Thank you so much. Yeah, our pleasure. Thank you so much.